at 11:43 on the morning of July 13, 2010. Mike Pappas heard his jackhammer hit something that wasn't bedrock. The sound changed. Concrete gave way to wood. He was 40 feet beneath the intersection of Pearl Street and Water Street in Lower Manhattan, excavating for a parking garage foundation. 32 years old, originally from Astoria, Queens, Pappas had been working construction for 14 years. He'd hit water mains, old sewer pipes, buried cables. This was different. The wood was massive, oak timbers, hand-hewn, still solid after God knew how many years underground. He shut off the jackhammer and called his foreman. Within 6 hours, the construction site would be crawling with archaeologists, historians, and city officials. What they found would rewrite New York's maritime history and reveal a ghost ship that had been buried beneath downtown Manhattan for 213 years. The discovery began with confusion. Pappas's foreman, Tony DeLuca, climbed down into the excavation pit and examined the timber. It was 12 inches thick, notched at one end, curved along its length. The grain was tight, old-growth oak. DeLuca had worked on renovation projects in colonial-era buildings. He recognized 18th-century carpentry when he saw it. But this wasn't a building foundation. The timber was part of something larger, something that curved away into the clay and filled dirt that made up Lower Manhattan's unstable ground. They found the second timber an hour later, then a third. By mid-afternoon, the pattern was unmistakable. These weren't random pieces of wood. They were ribs, the skeletal frame of a ship. The vessel was oriented east to west, its bow pointing toward what would have been the East River shoreline in the 18th century, except the East River was now 3 blocks away. The ship was buried under buildings, streets, and 2 centuries of landfill. DeLuca made the call to the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission at 3:17 p.m. He explained what they'd found. The commission dispatched archaeologist Diane Dalal to the site within 30 minutes. Dalal was 46, a senior staff member with the commission, specializing in colonial and Revolutionary War-era sites. She'd excavated tavern foundations, military fortifications, and burial grounds. She'd never excavated a ship. She arrived at the site at 4:02 p.m. and climbed down into the pit. The exposed timbers confirmed what DeLuca suspected. This was a wooden sailing vessel, buried intact, preserved by the clay and lack of oxygen 40 feet underground. Dalal photographed the timbers, measured them, and examined the joinery. The construction was typical of late 18th century merchant ships, solid, workmanlike, built for cargo rather than speed. She estimated the vessel was between 80 and 100 feet long. A significant portion of the hull appeared to be intact. The problem was time. The construction company had permits, deadlines, and contracts. Every day the site sat idle, cost money. The city needed to decide, protect the ship or let construction proceed. That decision fell to Amanda Sutphin, the Landmarks Preservation Commission's executive director. Sutphin arrived at the site at 6:30 p.m., just as the summer sun was beginning to set. She looked at the exposed timbers, consulted with Dalal, and made the call. The ship would be excavated and preserved. Construction would halt. The excavation began the next morning. Dalal assembled a team of 12 archaeologists, graduate students, and volunteers. They worked in shifts, carefully removing clay and fill dirt around the ship's hull. The wood was remarkably well preserved. The outer planking was intact. The ribs showed minimal rot. Even the tar caulking between planks remained pliable. The ship had been sealed in anaerobic clay. No oxygen, no decay. The vessel's shape emerged over 3 days of digging. It was a merchant ship, probably a Hudson River sloop, approximately 90 feet long, with a beam of 24 feet. The hull design suggested it had been built in the 1770s, possibly in a shipyard along the East River or in New Jersey. The keel was straight, the bow blunt, characteristics of working vessels designed to carry maximum cargo in shallow waters. On July 16th, the team made their most significant discovery. 22 feet from the stern, embedded in the clay between 2 ribs, Dalal found a leather shoe. It was a man's shoe, size 9 or 10, with a buckle. The leather was dark, stained by clay and groundwater, but intact. She photographed it in place, then carefully extracted it. The shoe dated to the late 1790s based on its construction and style. Someone had been aboard when the ship was abandoned or deliberately buried. More artifacts followed. Ceramic fragments from cooking vessels, iron nails, hand-forged, pieces of rope, still braided, impregnated with tar, a clay pipe stem. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and removed for conservation. The artifacts suggested the ship had been actively used until shortly before it was buried. This wasn't a derelict that had slowly decayed. It was a functioning vessel that had been deliberately filled with earth and abandoned. The question was why. Manhattan's shoreline in the late 18th century was very different from today. The East River waterfront extended only to what is now Water Street, exactly where the ship was found. Beyond that was water. The city's rapid growth after the Revolutionary War created demand for land. Property developers extended the shoreline by building wooden crib docks, filling them with earth and rubble, and constructing buildings on the new land. Ships that were too old or damaged to be worth repairing were often used as part of this fill. They were towed to the waterfront, stripped of anything valuable, filled with rocks and dirt, and incorporated into the new shoreline. The city literally built itself on top of its own maritime history. Records from the period were scarce. Most shipping manifests and port records from the 1790s had been lost in fires or simply discarded. But Dalal and her team found clues in newspaper archives. The New York Gazette from September 1797 contained an advertisement for old vessels suitable for cribbing and shoreline extension at the foot of Old Slip, just 2 blocks from where the ship was found. The timing matched. The ship had likely been sold for scrap, stripped of its masts and rigging, and deliberately sunk to create new land. The excavation revealed one more detail that stunned the archaeologists. On July 18th, while removing clay from the bow section, a team member found charring on the interior planking. The wood was blackened, burned in a pattern consistent with fire damage. The ship hadn't just been abandoned. It had caught fire, probably while in service. The damage wasn't catastrophic. The hull remained watertight below the waterline, but it would have made the vessel unseaworthy for cargo operations. That explained why it had been sold for landfill rather than repaired. Fire damage to a wooden ship was expensive to fix, and in the late 1790s, New York had dozens of new ships being launched every year. It was cheaper to buy a new vessel than repair an old one. By July 20th, the team had excavated as much of the ship as was accessible within the construction site. The aft third of the vessel extended beneath the foundation of an adjacent building and couldn't be reached without demolishing the structure, something the city wasn't willing to authorize. The decision was made to remove the accessible portion of the hull for preservation and study. Removing an 18th-century ship hull from 40 feet underground presented engineering challenges. The timbers, while structurally intact, were saturated with water and extremely heavy. Each rib weighed several hundred pounds. The keel section weighed over a ton. The team built a wooden support frame around the hull, essentially creating a cradle that would hold the ship together during extraction. On July 22nd, construction crews used a crane to lift the entire bow section, 28 feet of hull, complete with planking ribs and keel, out of the excavation in a single piece. The ship section was transported to the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory in St. Leonard, Maryland, one of the few facilities in the country equipped to preserve waterlogged wooden artifacts of this size. The conservation process would take years. The wood needed to be slowly dried and treated with polyethylene glycol to prevent it from cracking and disintegrating as it lost moisture. Each timber would be documented, photographed, and analyzed. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, would determine exactly when the trees used to build the ship had been cut, potentially revealing the vessel's construction date within a few years. While the ship was being conserved, researchers worked to identify it. They examined customs records, shipping manifests, and maritime insurance documents from the 1790s. They found references to several vessels that had disappeared from port records around 1797 to 1798, but none could be definitively linked to the buried ship. The vessel had no nameplate, No identifying marks. It was one of dozens, perhaps hundreds of small merchant ships that worked the Atlantic coast and Hudson River trade routes in the decades after the Revolution. What made the ship significant wasn't its identity. It was what it represented. The discovery proved that Lower Manhattan was literally built on its maritime past. Every block south of Fulton Street sat on landfill that contained shipwrecks, dock structures, and debris from 2 centuries of waterfront commerce. The Pearl Street ship was just the first to be properly excavated and studied. Archaeologists estimated there were at least 20 more buried ships beneath the streets and buildings of the financial district, each one a time capsule of New York's early history. The discovery also revealed how quickly the city had transformed. In 1797, the location where the ship was found had been open water. Ships tied up at docks, loaded and unloaded cargo, and sailed away. By 1810, that same spot was dry land, covered with buildings, streets, and businesses. The shoreline had moved 3 blocks east. The city had consumed its own waterfront and built over it. The buried ship was a monument to that transformation, a working vessel turned into literal foundation for urban expansion. The Pearl Street ship went on public display in 2014 at the South Street Seaport Museum. The preserved bow section sits in a climate-controlled gallery, still showing the scorch marks from the fire that ended its working life. Visitors can see the hand-hewn timbers, the tar caulking, the iron nails that held the planking in place. Information panels explain how the ship was built, how it was used, and how it ended up buried beneath one of the world's most expensive real estate markets. Mike Pappas, the construction worker who first hit the ship with his jackhammer, attended the opening. He brought his daughter, who was 7 at the time. He showed her the timber he'd first struck, oak, solid, scarred by 2 centuries underground, and the impact of his jackhammer. He explained that sometimes construction isn't just about building new things. Sometimes you find the old things that make the new things possible. The parking garage was eventually built, but the design was modified. The foundation was relocated 20 feet north to avoid disturbing any remaining ship timbers. The developers installed a glass panel in the garage's floor, allowing visitors to see the clay layer 40 feet down where the ship had rested. A plaque explains what was found and why it matters. It's a small gesture, but it acknowledges something important. Cities don't just grow up, they grow on top of what came before. Every street, every building, every foundation sits on layers of history, sometimes literally. The Pearl Street ship is estimated to have been built around 1773, based on dendrochronology of the oak timbers. That means it was sailing when the Declaration of Independence was signed. It probably carried cargo during the Revolutionary War, food, supplies, maybe weapons. It witnessed the British occupation of New York and the eventual American victory. It worked the Hudson River and coastal trade routes for nearly 25 years, before fire damage made it worthless as a vessel and valuable as landfill. The ship had no name that we know, no famous captain, no dramatic sinking or heroic rescue. It was a working boat that did ordinary work, hauling flour, timber, manufactured goods until it couldn't anymore. Then it became part of the city itself, buried and forgotten for 200 years. But that ordinariness is exactly what makes it important. History isn't just about the famous ships, the battles, the dramatic moments. It's about the daily work that makes civilization function. The merchant vessels, the cargo holds, the sailors who spent their lives moving goods from one port to another. That work built New York. The ship was part of that foundation, literally and figuratively. Today, when construction crews excavate in Lower Manhattan, they're required to have archaeologists on standby. Every dig has the potential to uncover more buried ships, more artifacts, more evidence of the city's maritime past. Some discoveries are reported, others aren't. Property owners worried about delays, developers anxious to keep projects on schedule. But the ships are there, waiting beneath the pavement and steel, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one a reminder that New York's story isn't just written in buildings and monuments. It's buried in the ground, preserved in clay, waiting for someone with a jackhammer to break through and bring it back to light. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from.